今天您将收看的是
他的 TED 演讲点击率在网络上累计超过1000万。他是麦克阿瑟天才奖、英联邦作家奖、橘子奖的得主。他是齐马曼达·恩戈兹·阿迪契。
大家好，观众朋友们，您现在看到的是今晚我们读书。齐马曼达·恩格兹·阿迪切，他是尼日利亚英语文学的作家，他继承了阿切贝这些尼日利亚作家的辉煌，书写着殖民时代的非洲社会。他也是非洲的第3代的这个作家。那么在今天的节目当中呢，我们请他作家本人来到节目的现场，我们和他一起来探讨一下他的写作。你好。
2019年上海书展期间，尼日利亚作家齐马曼达·恩戈兹·阿迪契举行了作品签售会。这部被齐努阿·阿契贝称为天纵之才的作家，带来了他的作品集《子木槿》《半轮黄日》《美国佬》《女性的权利》以及最新作品《亲爱的安吉维拉》。阿迪契1977年出生于尼日利亚南部城市埃努古，起初在尼日利亚大学学习医药学，后赴美国学习传媒学和政治学，之后又在约翰霍普金斯大学获得创意写作的文学硕士学位。2010年，阿迪契入选《纽约客》评出的20位40岁以下的小说家。2015年，《时代》杂志评选阿迪契为世界最有影响力的100人。
形成今天自己的这样的一种写作风格，您觉得和您的这个家庭的背景，从小受到的这个教育环境，以及后来留学欧美的那些这个成长的经历有着怎样的一种关系？
I grew up, my father was a professor, there were books in the house. I think that literature across cultures is a middle-class exercise. It's middle-class people who write novels and middle-class people who read novels generally. So I certainly think that my background plays a role in the fact that I'm a writer. Because I had books growing up, because I grew up in a family that expected me to read. But at the same time, I think the nature of African families, mostly, is that family is extended. So while my family had, relative privilege of being educated, I had cousins in the village who were not educated. And so my experience is quite broad. And so I feel that I'm in a position to write not just about middle-class people, but also about members of my family who are not as privileged as my family.
2003年，阿迪契的首部长篇小说《子木槿》获得2004年橘子小说奖的提名。该小说讲述了上世纪90年代尼日利亚的政治骚乱和一个被信仰裹挟的家庭的悲剧。他的第2部长篇小说《半轮黄日》窥探了尼日利亚的内战伤痛，获2007年橘子小说奖。他的长篇小说《美国佬》则摘得了2013年美国国家书评人协会奖小说奖。
首先呢，我们知道您出了好几本小说，从《子木槿》到《半轮黄日》，再到《美国佬》，而且呢，我们发现呢，这些小说的主人公从单个发展到了多个。能不能跟我们说一说看，您对这些小说是怎样进行布局，以及这样的一种叙事方式的设定的？
So in Purple Hibiscus, I wanted to write a very small story. I wanted to have a very focused narrative, and so I had it's from the point of view of this young girl, so it's just one person. But with my novel Half of a Yellow Sun, which is about the Nigerian Biafra War, I wanted to have a much wider perspective. I wanted to tell different stories about the war because I think people experience war differently. So I have a university professor, I have a domestic help, I have an Englishman. So I wanted to have a much broader range because I think that to tell the story of war, you really need to have multiple perspectives. So really, it's the subject of my books that determine the narrator.
我们知道这个子木槿当中这个父亲的形象尤金，他有着双重性，而且他自身有着一种矛盾，因为他就是一个进步的民主人士，同时呢，他又是一个原始宗教的这样的一个继承者，所以非常的矛盾。那么在塑造父亲这个形象的时候，你把他看作是一个，他既是施暴者，同时他也是接受暴力者。那么如何考虑他这个形象的塑造的？
I think people are complex. So I wanted to write about this man who is abusive to his family, but also on the other hand, he genuinely does good in the world. And I think that's the way human beings are. I don't think that most people are completely good or completely bad. I think people are complex. And I think with the character of Eugene, he really believes, because of his religion, that he's doing the right thing when he commits violence. And I find that very interesting. I'm very interested in how religion can make us do things. And we think those things are right, but actually they're not.
半轮黄日是尼日利亚女作家阿迪契为尼日利亚内战谱写的一曲哀歌。小说讲述了13岁的乌古家境贫寒，去恩苏卡大学的教授奥登尼伯家担任男仆。主人给予他的学习机会，让他逐渐摆脱了蒙昧和迷信。伊博族的酋长千金奥兰娜是奥登尼伯的女朋友，她的家族在内战前有显赫的声势财富。崇尚自由的奥兰娜却一直与势力投机的家人保持距离。奥兰娜的孪生姐姐凯内内一直照料着家族的生意，她和旅居尼日利亚的英国记者理查德之间产生了爱情。对后殖民主义的虚伪深恶痛绝的理查德一直试图公正客观地记录这个国家经历的一切。当那场极端残暴的战争爆发，当尼日利亚的北部和南部为后殖民主义的诅咒所驱使，并走向自相残杀的结局，这几个主人公的命运随之巨然改变。他们对自我、友谊和爱情的忠诚也面临严峻考验。
在这个《半轮黄日》这部小说当中啊，这个你写到了尼日利亚的内战。那个内战呢是发生在60年代啊，你是没有亲身经历过那段战争，为什么要写这样的一段战争？你觉得梳理那段战争对你个人有着怎样的一种帮助？
I was born in 1977 and the war ended in 1970s, but I feel that I grew up in the shadow of the war because both my parents lived through the war, and my family was very much affected by the war. My grandfathers died in the war. And so I grew up knowing that this war had affected my family very much. And I wanted to try and understand it for myself. So I read everything I could find about the war, and then I did many, many interviews. I talked to everyone who had lived through the war. I looked at archives, I listened to the music from that period. I really immersed myself in that period because I wanted to try and understand it for myself. It's a part of a history that I have, but that I didn't personally experience.
在这个尼日利亚的最大的人群当中啊，这个伊博族是占有相当多的这个人群。在他们的内战之后，在你们的内战之后呢，伊博族很多人都迁到其他的地方去了，所以呢，在官方话语当中，伊博族它是一个比较压抑的这样的一个族群。那么在你的创作当中也有这样的表现。那么在创作的过程当中，有没有感觉到这个再一次被压抑的感受？
So I think most countries have parts of their histories that they want to hide because they're not proud of it. And so in Nigeria, that period of the war from 1967 to 1970 is something we don't really learn about in school or talk about because I think as a country we're ashamed of it. But I don't think that the answer is silence. So for Igbo people, and I'm Igbo, my parents lived through the war, I think more of the stories are coming out. In a sense, I think that the generation that directly experiences trauma is not the generation that tells the story of trauma. I think sometimes it takes the following generation to tell the story. And that's what's happening now in Nigeria. So I did not experience the war, but I've told the story of the war. And more people are telling those stories. I think more Igbo people of my generation are looking back and are asking their parents and their grandparents, what happened? What's your story? And I think that for peace to happen in any country, it's important to tell the truth of the history of that country. And so I feel happy to be part of this kind of movement of telling the story of our history.
孩子还活着，我听见哭声了，我听见了。有人说，男人们、女人们都围拢过来帮忙，瞪大眼睛仔细看。一些人也在碎石中挖掘，另一些人旁观，还有一些人尖叫着打着响指。 一辆车正在燃烧，一个女子的尸体倒在边上，衣服全被烧光了，烧黑的皮肤上到处都是粉红的斑斑点点。有人用一个撕坏的麻袋盖住了这具尸体，但巫蛊仍能看见那双僵硬的漆黑如木炭的腿。天空乌云密布，即将到来的降雨带来了一股潮湿的味道，与烟火燃烧的气味混杂在一起。奥凯奥马和主人一起在碎石堆中挖掘。我听见了孩子的声音，又有人说我听见了孩子的声音。
半轮黄日当中的2位男主角啊，他都是这个作家的身份，可是呢，从他们的手稿上看，他们有着不同的结局和命运。这样写，你觉得对你来说是有着怎样的一种隐喻吗
？Yes. Yes. So yes, I think it's a metaphor. Obviously, I think it's fairly obvious that it's a metaphor. And for me, it's a metaphor for who owns a story, right? Who should tell a story. And for me, as a Nigerian, as an African, I'm very much aware that there is a tradition of African stories being told by Westerners. And so for me, in that book, it's a metaphor for African stories belong to Africans. So Richard is this lovely Englishman. He really cares about Biafra, but it's not his story to tell. It's not his story.
接下来您将收看的是
阿迪契的2个著名的 TED 演讲《单一故事的危险性》和其后的《我们都应该是女权主义者》，在网络上的点击率累计超过1000万。阿迪契的2个著名的 TED 演讲《单一故事的危险性》和其后的《我们都应该是女权主义者》，在网络上的点击率累计超过1000万。女性的权利是根据他的演讲修改成的长文。阿迪契从自身的女性经验出发，逐一反驳人们对女权主义者的各种认识误区和偏见，犀利地指出在职场、家庭、公共场合，女性因性别因素承受的各种不公境遇。
作为一个女性作家啊，常常被别人称为是女权主义作者。那么你的成功，目前所取得的小说方面的成就，也是源于你作为一个女性身份的那种细腻的观察和表达。但是有没有觉得作为一个女性的作家，她有一定的局限性？在这一点上，你是怎么想的？
Well, first of all, I don't think of myself as a feminist writer. I think of myself as a writer and a feminist. And for me, there's a difference because I think to have the label of feminist writer suggests that my literature is somehow feminist. And I don't think so. I think I have my political views, but when I write fiction, when I write literature, I don't start with my political views. I start with human beings. I want to write about connection, about love. But on the other hand, I write about feminism as a political thing because I care about it, because I am, angry at all the injustices that women experience throughout the world. But for me, they're two separate things. I think the category of women's writing can be limiting and can be a bit problematic because it has value. Right? In other words, there's no such thing as men's writing. So when men write, it's just writing. But when women write, it's women's writing. And that's what I have a problem with. Because the idea of women's writing means that somehow it's slightly beneath what men do. And, there's some women who've called it a ghetto, that to be considered a women's writer means that you're in a ghetto. And for me, what I would like is for men and women, for their writing to be judged on the content, not who wrote it, right? So we shouldn't say, women's writing means a particular thing, because women write about all kinds of things. And so I kind of feel uncomfortable with that category because I think it can limit women. It can limit how women are read. It can limit how they're reviewed. It can limit how seriously they're taken. And I think it also limits how critics in countries decide who the important writers are. So often in countries across the world, when critics are talking about the important writers, they're nearly always men. And I think that needs to change.
实际的情况是这样，在美国，一个男人和一个女人从事相同的工作，具有相同的条件资格，男人获得的薪酬更多，因为他是男的。所以不夸张地说，男人统治这个世界，这符合情理。换作在1000年前，因为那时的人类生活在一个最主要靠体力为生的世界里，体力更强的人更有望当首领，男人普遍体力更强，当然有许多例外。今天我们生活在一个迥然不同的世界，更有资格当首领的人不是体力更强的人，是更有智慧的人，更有学识的人，更有创意的人，更有革新精神的人。这些特质与荷尔蒙无关。在智慧、革新精神、创意上，男人的几率和女人平等。我们演进了，但我们的性别观念没有演进很多。
还有一部小说《美国佬》啊，这个《美国佬》当中的女主人公，您写到她的这个一些经历和爱情故事，这有您自己个人生活的一种影射吗？
The character of Ifemelo in Americana is not really me. I mean, I've used some of my experiences, but she is much more interesting than I am. And her life is much more fun than my life is. But I've used some of my experiences. So when I went to the US, like her, I went to the US when I was, 19. I went to go to university. So I've used details from the places that I lived in the US. So she goes to Princeton. I went to Princeton. She spent some time at Yale. I spent time at Yale because it's just easy to write about where you've been and where you know. But most of her experiences are not based on my life. I wanted to write about a young woman who's finding herself and who doesn't apologize. I think that's really important in fiction, to have a woman who is not interested in being likable, right? Who's herself. She makes mistakes, she's flawed, she's interesting. And then love. I wanted to write about love. I think love is the most important thing for human beings, apart from food and water. And Ifemelo, her love with Obinze, so she loves this young man, and they're separated because she goes to the US, he later goes to England, and it's really because Nigeria is kind of falling apart, and they want to leave, and they want to make more for themselves, they want better lives. I think what that love, the theme of love for me, is not only private. I would argue that love is both private and also political, because there are people in the world who cannot love the people they love for political reasons, cannot be with the people they love for political reasons. I think love is private, but not only private. That love exists in a societal structure. And for Ifemelo and Obinze, they're separated for a long time. And if they had been born in a different part of the world, if they had not been born Africans, I think their love would have been different.
阿迪契的最新作品《亲爱的安吉维拉》是阿迪契给好友的一封回信，书里涵盖了15条无价睿智的建议，关于如何将一个女儿培养成一个强大独立的女性。这些建议直接、有力而坦诚。亲爱的安吉维拉尖锐地触及了21世纪的性别政治的核心，它将开启一场全新的、被迫切需要的讨论，即在当下应该做一名什么样的女性。
那么在这个尼日利亚的这个文学领域啊，这个有一位阿契贝是你的前辈，那么你说曾经受他的影响，尤其是尼日利亚的民族语言上面受他的影响特别的大，能不能说说看你所理解的民族性在文学上的一种表现？
I think there's such diversity in Nigerian writing that it's difficult to talk about a particular Nigerian style. So the two major writers in Nigeria of that generation, Chinua Achebe and Wole Soyinka, are really different. And when I was growing up, I grew up reading books from from England, mostly, when I was really young. And so when I started writing, I was about 4, and I was writing exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. So here I was growing up in a small university town in Nigeria, but I was writing about little children in London. And Chinua Achebe was one of the writers who changed that for me. So I like to say that he gave me permission to write, because I read his book and suddenly I saw my own world in literature, and I had never seen that before. And suddenly I realized I can write about my life. I can write about mangoes. I don't have to write about apples. And that for me was really important because it gave me confidence to tell the stories that are familiar to me.
在您写作的过程当中，是否考虑到就是不同的阅读对象，包括不同的身份背景以及文化背景的人，他们的阅读习惯和接受以及理解，还是你只是执意于自己的写作之中？
In general, I don't think about audience when I write, because for me, I'm happiest when my writing is going well, and when it's going well, it's almost metaphysical. I feel transported. I'm really not there. I feel like I'm communing with the spirits. So I'm not thinking about audience, right? I'm thinking about the story. I'm inside the story. But I also think that literature is universal. And so when I write, I don't think about my audience. But if you ask me who I'm writing for, I would say I'm writing for everyone. I'm writing for anybody who likes the kind of writing that I like. And for me, it doesn't matter where that person comes from, because I think that it's through storytelling that we humans can connect with each other, right? So that for me, reading literature from different parts of the world makes me feel that I'm part of this larger human family.
非常感谢能够来到我们节目接受我们的访问。那么最后呢，我们希望这个阿迪切能够给我们带来更多更好的作品。今天我们大家从他的访问当中了解到他的身份背景、他的成长环境，所以带来了完全面貌不一样的这个英语文学写作。感谢他，也感谢电视机前的观众收看我们今天的节目。让我们下一次再见。旅居加拿大的作家贝拉推出了他的最新作品《幸存者之歌》。这是根据好莱坞著名的制作人麦克麦德沃父母的亲身经历为蓝本创作的长篇小说，也是贝拉《犹太人在上海》的系列的第2部。